November 4th, 1942, 09:45 hours, 15 miles west of El Alamein, Egypt. The dust cloud stretched across the entire southern horizon, British armor advancing in coordinated waves that seemed endless. General Major Wilhelm von Thoma stood beside his command vehicle, binoculars raised, watching the impossible become real. His radio operator was shouting reports from the remaining defensive positions, each one describing breakthrough, encirclement, retreat. "They're everywhere," a panzer commander screamed over the static. "Moving faster than we can reposition. They're cutting off our withdrawal routes." Von Thoma had fought the British for 18 months. He'd beaten them at Gazala. He'd humiliated them at Tobruk. He knew them as cautious, methodical opponents who could be outmaneuvered by aggressive German tactics. But these troops, advancing across the desert, bore little resemblance to the British forces he'd defeated repeatedly. These moved with German-style aggression and coordination, exploiting every gap in his crumbling defenses, pressing forward before his troops could reorganize. Through the dust, he could see their distinctive insignia on the approaching tanks: the Jerboa, the Desert Rat, painted on turrets and hulls; the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats. They'd been in North Africa since the beginning, had survived every battle, every defeat, and now they were moving like veterans who'd finally learned how to fight his way, and doing it better than his exhausted, fuel-starved Afrika Korps could counter. A British Sherman burst through the defensive line 300 meters to his left, its gun traversing, firing on the move. Von Thoma's remaining tanks tried to respond, but they were out of position, caught in the chaos of collapsing defense. Within minutes, his command position was surrounded. He raised his hands as British infantry closed in, professional and efficient, treating him correctly as captured general officer. As they led him toward the rear, von Thoma took one final look at the battlefield. The Desert Rats were everywhere, their tanks pushing west, their reconnaissance vehicles ranging ahead, their supply columns already moving through captured German positions. The hunter had become the hunted, and Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps was being crushed by opponents they'd once dismissed as amateurs. The early disasters. The 7th Armored Division's evolution from defeated force to victors of El Alamein required learning brutal lessons through repeated tactical failures against superior German forces. The division arrived in North Africa in 1940 with excellent morale but inadequate equipment and doctrine. Their light tanks, cruisers and Matildas had thin armor and unreliable mechanical systems. Their tactics emphasized dispersed formations and individual initiative, which worked against Italian forces but proved disastrous against Germans. Their coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery was poor, with each arm operating semi-independently rather than as integrated force. Rommel's arrival in February 1941 with the Afrika Korps exposed these deficiencies ruthlessly. German tanks were better armored and more reliable. German tactics emphasized concentration of force and combined arms coordination. German commanders exploited British tendency to disperse their armor, destroying British tank formations piecemeal, while British infantry and artillery watched helplessly from positions they couldn't abandon to support their tanks. The defeats accumulated through 1941 and into 1942. Operation Battle Axe in June 1941 saw British armor charging German anti-tank screens and being destroyed in detail. Operation Crusader in November 1941 achieved tactical success, but at enormous cost in tanks and crews. The retreat from Gazala in May 1942 was near disaster, with British forces barely escaping encirclement that might have destroyed the entire 8th Army. Tobruk's fall in June 1942 surrendering 33,000 British and Commonwealth troops, represented perhaps the nadir of British fortunes in North Africa. The 7th Armoured Division participated in all these operations and learned from each defeat. Tank crews discovered which British tanks were death traps, the light Crusaders and Stuarts that couldn't survive hits from German guns. They learned which tactics were suicidal, charging prepared positions, operating without infantry support, dispersing instead of concentrating. They identified which German capabilities were most dangerous. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns used in anti-tank roles, the German ability to coordinate armor and artillery, Rommel's willingness to accept risk for tactical advantage. The transformation. General Bernard Montgomery's appointment as 8th Army Commander in August 1942 initiated systematic changes in British tactics, organization, and approach to desert warfare. Montgomery's assessment of 8th Army was scathing. He found forces that were tactically confused, poorly coordinated, and psychologically defeated despite still possessing numerical superiority. British commanders had developed excessive respect for Rommel that bordered on defeatism, assuming that German tactical excellence would overcome British advantages in numbers and logistics. The army needed fundamental reform in how it fought, not just additional equipment or reinforcements. The reforms Montgomery implemented were comprehensive. He prohibited dispersal of armor, insisting that tank formations operate concentrated where they could achieve local superiority. He demanded better coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery, creating integrated battle groups that combined all arms rather than having them operate independently. He emphasized methodical preparation over improvisational brilliance, accepting that British commanders weren't as tactically gifted as Rommel, but could win through superior planning and resources. Most importantly, Montgomery restored confidence through discipline and clear command. He established that 8th Army would fight according to plans he developed, that commanders would follow orders rather than improvising, that British forces would exploit their advantages rather than attempting to match German tactical flexibility. The approach was unsubtle but effective. Montgomery recognized that British Army's strength was systematic execution of prepared plans rather than improvisation under fluid conditions. The 7th Armored Division benefited from these changes while also bringing hard-won experience to Montgomery's reformed army. Their crews knew desert warfare intimately after 2 years of continuous operations. They understood German tactics from repeated exposure. They'd identified what worked and what didn't through costly trial and error. When Montgomery's methodical approach was combined with their tactical knowledge, the result was formation that could employ German-style aggression within framework of British systematic planning. Equipment improvements accompanied tactical reforms. American Sherman tanks arrived in quantity by autumn 1942, providing reliable armor with adequate guns that could engage German tanks on roughly equal terms. The Grant tanks, with their sponson-mounted 75mm guns, gave British forces high explosive capability that previous British tanks lacked. Improved anti-tank guns, primarily the 6-pounder, could penetrate German armor at combat ranges. British forces still lacked truly superior equipment, but they'd achieved rough parity that made tactical competence decisive rather than equipment quality. El Alamein, the methodical offensive. Montgomery's plan for El Alamein reflected his understanding of British and German strengths and weaknesses. British forces possessed numerical superiority, approximately 195,000 troops and over 1,000 tanks against German-Italian forces of approximately 116,000 troops and 500 tanks. British logistics were secure, with supply lines running back to Egyptian ports. German logistics were precarious, dependent on Mediterranean shipping that British naval and air forces interdicted effectively. The battle plan exploited these advantages through methodical approach that minimized improvisation. British forces would attack on narrow front, where they could concentrate superior forces, breach German defensive lines through systematic infantry and engineer assaults supported by artillery, then exploit the breach with armor, advancing through cleared lanes. The approach required extensive preparation, but reduced risks of tactical surprises that had doomed previous British offensives. The 7th Armored Division's role in El Alamein was primarily exploitation, breaking through German positions once infantry had created gaps, pursuing retreating German forces, preventing organized withdrawal that might allow Afrika Korps to establish new defensive lines. This played to the division's strengths: their crew's experience in mobile operations, their understanding of desert navigation and logistics, their ability to maintain operational tempo during sustained advances. The battle began on October 23rd, with massive artillery barrage followed by infantry assaults that ground forward through German minefields and defensive positions. The fighting was brutal and costly, but British forces maintained pressure through superior numbers and systematic rotation of frontline units. German counterattacks were beaten back through concentrated defensive fire. By November 2nd, German defensive line had been breached in multiple locations, and Afrika Korps' tactical situation was becoming untenable. The breakthrough came on November 4th, when British armor finally achieved operational freedom beyond German defensive positions. The 7th Armored Division and other British tank formations advanced rapidly westward, engaging German rearguards while bypassing strong points, maintaining pressure that prevented organized German withdrawal. This was a moment when British forces demonstrated they'd mastered mobile warfare. They moved as quickly as Germans had in their 1941-1942 offensives, coordinated armor and supporting arms effectively, exploited German confusion through aggressive maneuver. The pursuit. German forces attempted to conduct fighting withdrawal, establishing successive defensive lines to delay British advance, while withdrawing main forces westward. But British pressure was relentless. The 7th Armored Division and other formations advanced continuously, engaging German rearguards before they could prepare positions, forcing premature withdrawals that prevented methodical retreat. The pursuit maintained operational tempo that exploited British logistical advantages while preventing Germans from utilizing their tactical skill effectively. The advance covered over 1,300 miles from El Alamein to Tunisia, executed across desert terrain that tested endurance and logistics. British forces maintained their advance through systematic logistical planning that had been absent from earlier operations. Supply columns followed advancing formations closely, providing fuel and ammunition that allowed sustained operations. Air support was coordinated effectively, with RAF providing reconnaissance and ground attack missions that disrupted German movements. The operational execution demonstrated that British forces had achieved competence in mobile warfare that matched their opponents. German attempts at counterattack were defeated through concentration of force. When Afrika Korps attempted to establish defensive positions at key terrain, British forces would concentrate armor and artillery, deliver prepared assaults that overwhelmed defensive positions through superior numbers, then resume pursuit. The pattern repeated throughout the advance. German tactical skill couldn't compensate for British material superiority and improved operational execution. Rommel's personal command of the retreat couldn't restore Afrika Korps' deteriorating situation. He was physically ill, exhausted from continuous operations, frustrated by logistical limitations that prevented effective resistance. His forces were running out of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. British air interdiction was destroying supply convoys. Italian forces that comprised much of Axis strength in North Africa were collapsing under sustained pressure. The legendary Desert Fox found himself commanding forces that couldn't execute the mobile warfare that had been his trademark because they lacked resources for sustained operations. The 7th Armored Division participated throughout this pursuit, their jerboa insignia becoming symbol of British victory in desert. Their vehicles, many painted with personal names and decorations that reflected crews' individualism, advanced across terrain they'd retreated over in previous years, passing battlefields where they'd suffered defeats, finally experiencing sustained operational success after years of disappointments. Rommel's recognition. Field Marshal Rommel's assessment of British performance at El Alamein, and afterward reflected his professional recognition that his opponents had overcome their previous deficiencies. Rommel's diary entries and correspondence during the battle documented his growing concern about British tactical improvements. He noted that British attacks were better coordinated, that British armour was operating more effectively with supporting arms, that British commanders were exploiting opportunities more aggressively. While he attributed much of this to Montgomery's systematic approach, he also recognized that British forces generally had improved their tactical execution substantially since earlier campaigns. His assessment was strategic as well as tactical. Rommel recognized that British logistical advantages, combined with improved tactical competence, created situation that German forces couldn't overcome through tactical skill alone. The Afrika Korps was being systematically ground down through British material superiority applied through competent operational execution. Without substantial reinforcements and improved logistics, German forces couldn't prevent eventual defeat regardless of tactical performance. The recognition was professional rather than defeatist. Rommel continued directing German forces competently throughout the retreat, conducting fighting withdrawal that prolonged resistance and inflicted casualties on pursuing British forces. But he understood that he was delaying inevitable rather than contesting achievable victory. His forces were improving despite resource limitations, but British forces were improving faster from position of material superiority that German tactical excellence couldn't overcome. Von Thomann's capture symbolized the reversal of fortunes. One of Afrika Korps' most experienced armor commanders, a veteran of Eastern Front and North African campaigns, surrendered to British troops who 18 months earlier had been repeatedly defeated by forces he'd helped command. The physical capture was less significant than what it represented. German forces that had dominated tactically were now being operationally overwhelmed by opponents who'd learned from their defeats. The final act. The Afrika Korps' final destruction in Tunisia in May 1943 completed process that El Alamein had initiated. Systematic defeat of German forces in North Africa through British material superiority and improved tactical competence. German forces in Tunisia attempted to establish defensive positions that might prolong resistance, but they faced impossible strategic situation. British 8th Army, advancing from east, and Allied forces, advancing from west, after Operation Torch landings, created pincer that compressed Axis forces into shrinking perimeter. Supply lines across Mediterranean were effectively severed by Allied naval and air superiority. German and Italian forces were running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies. The 7th Armored Division participated in final operations that reduced Axis defensive positions and forced surrender of remaining German-Italian forces. By May 13th, 1943, approximately 240,000 Axis troops surrendered, effectively destroying German presence in North Africa and eliminating Italian military capability. The victory was comprehensive and final. Unlike earlier British successes that German forces had recovered from, this defeat was irreversible strategic disaster for Axis. The Desert Rats had participated throughout the North African campaign from its beginning in 1940 to its conclusion in 1943. They'd endured defeats, learned from failures, adapted their methods, and ultimately participated in decisive victory. Their jerboa insignia had become recognizable symbol of British persistence. The desert rat that survives in harsh environment through adaptation and determination, that outlasts more impressive predators through endurance rather than brilliance. Rommel's realization. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, watched his Afrika Korps disintegrate from his command post in Libya. The reports coming in were catastrophic. Entire battalions cut off, tank formations destroyed, supply convoys burned by RAF attacks. His legendary tactical skill meant nothing when his forces had no fuel to maneuver, no ammunition to fight, no supplies to sustain operations. But what shocked him most wasn't the material superiority. It was how the British were fighting. The Desert Rats and other Eighth Army formations were using his own tactics against him. Rapid movement, aggressive exploitation, relentless pressure that prevented defensive reorganization. They'd learned from 2 years of defeats, absorbed every lesson his Afrika Korps had taught them, and now they were executing mobile warfare better than his exhausted, starving troops could counter. He wrote in his diary on November 5th, "The enemy advances with unprecedented speed and coordination. Our defensive positions are overrun before we can prepare them. Their tank formations operate with confidence we once possessed. The British have become masters of the Desert War." By November 15th, he was ordering full retreat to Tunisia, abandoning Libya entirely. The Desert Rats pursued relentlessly across 1,300 miles of desert, the same ground where Rommel had chased them in 1941. Every German attempt to establish defensive lines was broken by British formations that moved faster, hit harder, and refused to give the Afrika Korps time to recover. The final pursuit. The advance from El Alamein to Tunisia became legendary pursuit operation that demonstrated how completely the Desert Rats had mastered desert warfare. British armor moved day and night, bypassing strongpoints, cutting off retreat routes, maintaining pressure that turned orderly withdrawal into chaotic flight. German rearguards tried to delay the advance, but were overwhelmed by British forces that had superior numbers, better logistics, and finally, equal tactical competence. The Desert Rats led the pursuit, their jerboa insignia becoming symbol of British victory. Tank crews who'd retreated across this same desert in 1941 and 1942 now advanced as conquerors, passing burned-out German vehicles, abandoned supply dumps, all the detritus of defeated army. The psychological reversal was complete. Forces that had learned to fear Rommel's name now chased his broken divisions across Africa. In Tunisia, surrounded by British Eighth Army from the east and Allied forces from the west, the Afrika Korps made its final stand. By May 1943, approximately 240,000 Axis troops surrendered, the complete destruction of German presence in North Africa. Among the surrendering forces were veterans who'd fought since 1941, men who'd witnessed the transformation of their British opponents from hapless victims into relentless pursuers. A captured German officer, interviewed after the surrender, was asked about fighting the Desert Rats. His answer was simple. "In 1941, we hunted them. In 1942, they learned to hunt us. By 1943, we were the prey. The moment of truth. When Rommel was finally recalled to Germany in March 1943, leaving his successor to manage the inevitable surrender, he carried with him recognition that his opponents had overcome their weaknesses. The British hadn't become tactically brilliant. They'd become tactically adequate while exploiting massive material advantages. But adequate tactics combined with superior resources and relentless execution had proven sufficient to crush his outnumbered, undersupplied Afrika Korps. The Desert Rats had spent 3 years learning how to fight in North Africa. They'd endured defeats, absorbed casualties, lost countless tanks and crews. But they'd persisted, adapted, and ultimately mastered the environment that had once belonged to Rommel. Their nickname, the Desert Rat, that small, tough creature that survives in harsh conditions through adaptation and endurance, had proven prophetic. They'd outlasted the Desert Fox himself through sheer stubborn refusal to be defeated permanently, learning from every failure until they finally achieved the competence necessary to exploit their advantages. Von Thoma, released from British captivity after the war, was asked by a journalist about his capture at El Alamein. His response captured the reversal completely. "I had fought them for 18 months and beaten them repeatedly. I knew their weaknesses: poor coordination, weak armor, cautious tactics. But at El Alamein, I faced different army. The Desert Rats who surrounded my position moved like veterans who'd finally learned their trade. They were using our tactics, our aggression, our methods. Rommel had taught them too well, and we'd given them too much time to learn. When I raised my hands to surrender, I knew the Desert War was lost, not because we were defeated in that battle, but because they'd finally become better at desert warfare than we were. The Desert Rats had crushed the Afrika Korps not through brilliance, but through persistence. The unglamorous, typically British quality of simply refusing to quit, learning from defeats, adapting systematically, and grinding forward until material advantages and hard-won competence combined to achieve victory that had once seemed impossible.